Welcome back to Scaling Theory. My guest today is Arvind Narayanan, a professor of computer science at Princeton University and the director of the Center for Information Technology Policy, also at Princeton. Arvind is renowned for his work on the societal impact of digital technologies, including his textbook on fairness and machine learning, his online course on cryptocurrencies, his research on data de-anonymization, dark patterns, and more. He has already amassed over 30,000 citations on Google Scholar. In just a few days, in late September 2024, Arvind will release a book co-authored with Sayash Kapoor titled AI Snake Oil, subtitled What Artificial Intelligence Can Do, What It Can't, and How to Tell the Difference. Having had the privilege of reading an early version, our conversation delves into some of the book's key arguments. We also explore what Arvind calls AI scaling myth, the reality of artificial general intelligence, how governments can scale effective AI policies, the importance of transparency, the role that antitrust can and cannot play, the societal impacts of scaling automation, and more. I hope you enjoy our conversation. All right, so I've divided the conversation into two different parts. In part one, I want to talk about scaling laws behind AI, and then I want to move to the more policy-oriented questions. So starting with scaling, you recently published a short piece titled AI Scaling Myth, which of course captured my attention, in which you explain why increasing computing capacity won't continue to improve models indefinitely. And we discussed this topic actually with Sarah Hooker in episode 8 of the podcast, but you take a different approach. As you explain, and I quote, scaling laws only quantify the decrease in perplexity, that is, improvements in how well models can predict the next word in a sequence, end of quote, while what matters the most to users, and I quote you again, are emergent abilities, that is, models' tendency to acquire new capabilities, end of quote. Given that there is no guarantee that increasing scale will continue to bring new capabilities, you call scaling a myth. Please unpack the science behind this statement for us.
Sure. Scaling is not a myth. We didn't call scaling a myth, and companies have been, successfully building bigger and bigger models that are more and more capable. The question is whether that will continue into the future indefinitely, and I think that's where the myth comes in. And a lot of people believe that companies are going to be able to continue throwing more hardware at the problem, building bigger and bigger models until we get to artificial general intelligence or AGI. We can talk a bit later about how AGI is defined, but really world-changing AI, basically. And that's what we disagree with, and that's where these scaling laws come in. I think a big part of the reason why some people are so optimistic is these nice trends that have held for several orders of magnitude as these models have increased from millions to billions to almost a trillion parameters being the connections between these neurons in a neural network. And so the question is, are you going to be able to make them bigger and bigger and get to amazing levels of capability? We don't think that's going to happen. And that's because when you look at the reason why models have been getting more and more capable, it's because we think they're picking up more and more skills from the training data. So the reason that large language models are good at translation, for instance, is that there is a lot of data on the web which is present in different language pairs. And humans have previously translated it. The reason that models are good at chess, for instance, which is absolutely remarkable given that they have not been explicitly taught the rules of chess. So while that is remarkable, that is simply a consequence of the fact that there are billions, literally billions of chess games that are recorded online. So they're really picking up these human skills that we have put online that models can learn, they can kind of remix those skills in a few ways, but nothing in my mind amazing. They're not able to do too much more than what's in the training data. And at this point, companies are essentially already using all the data on the web to train these models. So there are just not a lot of new skills that I think these models can pick up. That said, they might, get a little bit better with more training just based on the same data sets. It might be possible to get slightly larger data sets. It's not going to happen indefinitely. It's not going to get these models to some kind of superhuman performance on most tasks.
Yeah, so there is a lot there to unpack. We have the full conversation for that. You've mentioned AGI. You talked about people believing that more scale equals more better quality and maybe eventually leading the markets, which brings me to antitrust, something we'll discuss toward the end of the conversation. But last, you talked about data. And this is also something that you tackled in that piece. And you predict that acquiring more data will become actually more costly because one, the data that is easily available has been scraped already. And two, the copyright holders are putting a price tag on data that is ever increasing. And some argue in response to that we can use synthetic data and that with the use of synthetic data, well, you can actually increase the volume of data at a very cheap price, but you actually disagree. So please explain.
Yeah, this is something that I would very much again call a myth. I think synthetic data is very useful. Companies have been using synthetic data. There are some models that are trained primarily using synthetic data. I'm not at all disputing the usefulness of synthetic data. The key point I'm making, though, and we talk about this in the essay with Sayash Kapoor, is that synthetic data is being used to improve the quality of the data, quality in a very specific sense. That is, you can, instead of requiring, let's say, 1 terabyte to get a model to a specific capability level, you can do it using, let's say, only 100 gigabytes. And that's a tenfold decrease in the amount of data that you need. So, in a sense, ironically, it's being used to decrease the volume of training data. And so that doesn't mean that if you take these synthetic data generation pipelines and generated an indefinite amount of training data, that these models are going to pick up new capabilities. They're not. It's allowing us to train these models efficiently, but unless the synthetic data generator has learned a skill, how can that skill be reflected in the output of the data generator? And how can that then be picked up by the new model? Right. So it's kind of like a snake eating its own tail. And this process is not going to teach models new skills. You're just still fundamentally constrained by what is represented in the data on the web.
Okay, so we covered two myths already. More compute will continue to improve models to the point of reaching AGI. That's number one. Number two, you can use synthetic data and keep on having ever larger data set and reach AGI. Let me see if there is a third or if we are here discussing something that is not a myth. There is a lack of a linear relationship between capabilities and data size, model size, compute. This is what we covered. In my view, though, it doesn't mean that the scaling of AI is a complete myth. And for example, one may observe that AI capabilities will actually scale and are scaling with the size of the ecosystem to which they have access to. And what I mean by that is that if you are Google or Facebook or one of those big tech companies and you can actually deploy the model to billions of users, you can generate money with those models. You can probably, with the money you have, acquire more quality data and buy compute, and because it will become slightly better, attract more users and actually advertise. I mean, it's the Olympic Games right now when we are recording this episode, and Google Gemini is advertising all over France, right, as to why you should use their product instead of OpenAI and others. So what do you make of that? Is your argument that the myth of AI scaling is merely technical, such as we discussed so far, or does it also apply to business dynamics?
Right. So companies have been talking for a while about getting this flywheel going where they get more user data and that helps better train the model. Yeah, totally. I think models are going to improve on that basis. To me, that's just fundamentally different from the kind of model scaling we're talking about. We're not talking about building bigger and bigger models. We're just talking about making the models more adaptable to different real life situations. That's definitely a kind of progress we need very much in AI. And a major limitation of these current AI systems is that they're just trained from data scraped from the web, and they're not learning so far from back and forth interactions with users. And that leads to some really hilarious failure cases. So, my favorite example is every time a new model comes out, I try to play rock, paper, scissors with the model. And I tell it, let's play rock, paper, scissors. You go first. And, the model says rock, for instance, right? And I say, I'm playing paper. And the model's like, oh, you win. Paper beats rock. Do you want to go again? And then we keep doing this over and over. Every time the model goes first, and every time I keep winning. And then I ask the model, why do you think I won? Most of the models don't understand what's going on. They don't understand that this is different from usual rock, paper, scissors, that I can see its answer and change my answer based on that. Just, incredible lack of common sense. But that's what you should expect when these models have not been trained based on user interactions, right? So these are examples of current limitations with these models that we're going to be able to close using these other types of scaling you're talking about. But there's just a fundamental difference between that and the kind of scaling we've had so far, where it's like totally new capabilities, right? Up to a certain scale, the models could only do well in English, but now you increase the scale by an order of magnitude, and suddenly they can do reasonably well in dozens of different languages, right? So that, while that was happening, that just seemed like magic, and people were just wondering what's the next quote unquote emergent ability. Is it going to be something superhuman that's going to allow AI to take over? It's that line of thinking that we think is a little bit silly, and that kind of emergent abilities may have mostly run out already or may continue for a little while longer, but are going to run out pretty soon.
Okay, so that leads me to AGI, artificial general intelligence. But before, I do have to ask, because you may know the answer. I thought they were actually an optimal strategy when playing rock, paper, scissors, right? There is a way of playing so that you will maximize chances of winning. Not talking about playing with a computer, but between two humans. Have you heard of that? Or
There are actually machine learning algorithms that do really well against humans, and humans consistently lose to these algorithms. And the reason for that is that people have predictable patterns. So if you played paper one time and lost, people will try to pick scissors the next time because scissors beats paper. But then the model can predict that this is what the human is going to do. However, the optimal strategy is just to play randomly, and if you play randomly, on average, it's going to be a wash. But again, all of that doesn't apply when you're playing rock, paper, scissors with a chatbot because it assumes that two people can select their choices at the same time without seeing each other's choices. And that's just not possible when it comes to a chatbot.
yeah, I'll be curious to try. I don't have access to the new OpenAI, voice. I forgot the name they gave to it, where it can actually talk with the model, see if it's a bit smarter. But okay, let's
Yeah.
jump in
Yeah.
time and go straight to AGI. So it is undefined, something you cover in your book. But let us assume, for the sake of our discussion, that it involves consciousness. Some argue that AGI will emerge from new levels of sophistication, i.e., new architectures combined with scale, while others argue that it won't ever emerge. On which side are you?
Sure. So, a couple of things about my views on this, and then I'll get to your actual question. So, the first is it's not that AGI is undefined, it's almost that it has too many definitions. Different people have different definitions implicitly or explicitly, and they end up talking past each other. What's harder to define is what general intelligence means in humans, and I hear from cognitive scientists that, you know, uh, in humans, they don't really talk about this notion of general intelligence, and yeah, that might be true. But when it comes to AI, certainly we can define it in various ways. And for us, the definition that we strongly prefer has nothing to do with consciousness. We think that's a distraction. The definition that's important to us is whether AI can automate essentially all of the tasks that are economically valuable. We're really laser focused on this particular definition, and we should have made that more clear in the AI scaling myths post. And the reason for that is this is what matters from the perspective of what the societal effects will be, what the economic effects will be, and potentially the safety effects as well. And so I think that is what we should be thinking about and measuring. I don't want to talk too much about consciousness. I neither have the the training in terms of human consciousness to talk about that, nor do I think that's, I also don't think that's the most relevant definition of AGI. But nonetheless, we can definitely talk about the other part of your question. So, can AGI be achieved, or, is that also a myth? Um, to me, if you take consciousness out of the equation, there's nothing, in the laws of physics really that prevents AI from automating all um, kind of utilitarian tasks at least. So if part of the job of being, let's say, a therapist, a mental health counselor, is just sitting down and listening to the person and empathizing with them, that's not the kind of thing AI can automate, presumably. Uh, on the other hand, if you're talking about tasks like machine learning research, notably, right, which is purely a matter of turning some bits into other bits, I think that's very much the kind of task that AI can potentially automate. I see no reason that it's impossible. I don't have a strong prediction of whether we what sorts of specific innovations will get us there. I do feel fairly confident that scaling alone will not get us there, and new scientific breakthroughs are needed.
So, on your definition of it, let me ask a question. I'm not sure if you've seen recently a framework for defining AGI that was put out by, I think was released by Bloomberg and put out by OpenAI, where they said that the final level of it would be that you can automate all of what a company would do. Is it compatible with your definition of it? And if so, do we want that?
Right, that is very, very similar to my definition. Do we want that? I mean, that's that's a very broad question. I think that kind of capability is going to have lots of positive effects, lots of negative effects. I think it's less a question of do we want that, and more of how do we govern AI so that we can reap the benefits of automation without suffering massive, job displacement and other kinds of negative societal consequences.
Yeah.
And so I know that many people have been excited about universal basic income, for instance, or unconditional cash transfers to people so that if someone loses their job, for instance, they have a cushion while they look for something else, acquire new skills, that sort of thing. There was a recent big study around universal basic income that actually found somewhat disappointing results, or actually very disappointing results. So,
Mm.
but I think that's the kind of research that's needed. So, it's less about do we want it, do we not want it, and more about we know some types of disruption are going to happen. Whether that's AGI or not. How do we prepare for that disruption and minimize negative impacts?
Yeah, and that will bring our conversation toward policy. But before that, maybe let's talk about risks just a tiny bit, because indeed it's a question that you can address as opposed to do we want it, which is more like kind of an initial reaction that people discuss in cafes. So if AI is to scale, we have a choice, and by we I mean all of us, right? Society, and to the extent to which it's a real choice, maybe we can discuss. But let's say there are two alternatives right now between open and closed models, where most of the foundation models are, of course, on a spectrum. And this is something we discussed already quite a lot on the podcast, but in a recent working paper titled On the Societal Impact of Open Foundation Models, you actually offer a risk assessment framework for assessing the marginal risk of open foundation models compared to the closed models. Could you please unpack that framework for us?
Yeah, so this was a paper that was a collaboration of 25 different authors from 16 different institutions. We were one of the leads. There were people at Stanford and MIT who were also among the team that led this effort. We released it as a working paper 6 months ago, and since then it's been peer reviewed at ICML. And I've been very happy to see that it's already having an impact on policy. The government, U.S. government, the NTIA specifically, recently released a report on what policy should be on in this area, and it drew heavily from our report. Okay, so what do we actually say in there? I think the question of are open foundation models dangerous has been a little bit oversimplified and kind of alarmist. So I think the kinds of questions we should be asking are okay, so if we're worried about the risks of open foundation models, if there were not to be an open foundation model, what would be in its place? It could be a closed foundation model. It could just be pre-AI technologies. And what I mean by this is there have been concerns that foundation models can help bioterrorists by helping them access information about bioweapons. But this is, for the most part, information that's already on the internet. And so if it's just helping them access that information, is that really what we're worried about? Or should we only worry if this is a new capability that it's going to provide that bad actors could not acquire in other ways? So that's the key difference between kind of absolute risk and marginal risk that we put forth. And when we carefully analyze the risks based on this marginal risk framework, at present, there's really no evidence for most kinds of misuse risks that having models released openly enables bad actors to do things more easily than they otherwise could. This could change in the future, but I think for now, policy should default strongly to not restricting the open release of models. There's a separate question of whether policymakers should promote openly released AI and open source AI. But there's a more basic question of should they restrict companies from releasing models openly? And I think these are two very different kinds of questions. For the government to step in and say people shouldn't do this activity that's economically beneficial and, in a way, part of people's self-expression, building these models and sharing them. The open source has a long tradition where its value is partly cultural. It goes beyond its utilitarian economic value. For the government to say, no, you can't do this, right? And it would only be effective if it were enforced worldwide. So you need some kind of unprecedented international cooperation in an almost authoritarian sense for all governments to come together and to say that no one should release foundation models openly. So that we think is a very, very high bar, and the bar for evidence to advocate for that kind of policy should be extremely high. And right now, the evidence is pretty much non existent that open foundation models are more risky. And so I think for now, we should default to openness, but definitely keep monitoring the situation and looking at new evidence.
Okay, so you've mentioned policy quite a few times, which brings me to part two of our conversation. And and here again, I want to start with a general question to get it started on this idea of discussing the policy implications of your work. If a country wanted to scale the AI capabilities of its companies and citizens, what would be the absolute worst thing to do, and what would be the top priority?
Absolute worst thing to do. I don't know. There are so many bad things that policymakers can do, usually unintentionally, not anticipating the effects of their policies. Let me tell you one kind of bad policy that's being proposed right now is to treat foundation models as munitions. So this is the idea that if other countries, this is happening in the United States, possibly in other countries as well, the idea that if foreign actors are able to access these foundation models, that will give them a leg up, and it's a matter of national security, that sort of thing. I think treating foundation models as munitions means that companies will not be able to release this technology, and it will have such a chilling effect on the development of the technology that any country that pursues this policy is just going to be shooting itself in the foot. And I think it's one of the worst things that I can imagine.
Mm.
Um, yeah, what would be the best thing to do? I mean, it's just cultivate the tech ecosystem. I think in a country like the United States, there's so much venture capital that I don't think governments need to do anything specifically to enable that. And the other side of it is for governments to address risks. because the more they can address the risks stemming from AI development, the more trust the public will have. And if they don't do that, if there are widespread harms from AI, the public will legitimately, I think, push back against continued development of AI.
Yeah. So that requires a very nuanced conversation, which is something I very much enjoyed in your book, where when we talk about regulation or policy in AI, you hear some people saying that it's the far west and there are no regulations and that the law is always lagging behind technology. Well, if you actually get involved in the space, you would know that most of the principles for criminal law and contract and torts actually do apply to AI system as well. And on the other end, you hear that we overregulate and therefore will kill innovation, and that the absolute best thing we can do is not to regulate at all the space. And we also have economic evidence showing that, well, good, tangible, robust regulation can actually be good for the space, which brings us to something which is maybe in between, or at least something more nuanced, and that is the idea of making regulation adaptive to new evidence. And this is actually something that you propose, where you say that processes should be more responsive to new evidence, and that policymakers should therefore put in place those processes. Can you please give our listeners a taste of your arguments and explain how those adaptive regulation will work in your view?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so the book is called AI Snake Oil, and a big part of the final chapter is about policy, where we discuss a lot of the ideas that you mentioned. And yes, we kind of reject the claim that policy always lags behind technology, but at the same time, we very much recognize that with the speed that tech is moving, there are a lot of ways in which the policymaking process could be better, more adaptive. And so let me give two examples of that, a negative example and a positive example. The negative example is what happened with social media. For well over a decade now, we've been hearing anecdotes about the negative impact of social media on democracy, on the mental health of teenagers, and so forth. But the research has taken a very long time to really get get going and have the usual academic debates about methodology and move toward any kind of consensus. That hasn't really happened yet. And if you look at some of the research on the impact of smartphones or devices on children, most of this research is like, oh, let's go measure the correlation between screen time and mental health. And we're like, what? What is screen time? I mean, we know what screen time is. It's just the amount of time people are using devices. That's an extremely crude measure. Like, every parent knows that there is an enormous difference between different types of activities you can do on your phone. Instagram can be very addictive, but there are also learning apps and everything in between. Even if you take a particular app like let's say YouTube, there's the whole range between completely trashy clickbait channels and even violence and gore that's sometimes targeted at children, shockingly, all the way to learning channels, which just based on personal experience, my kids have learned so much in terms of math and reading from watching videos. So if we're not attuned to these nuances, and if we have researchers measuring, I would say, fairly useless things like the correlation between screen time and mental health, it's not really informing the policy debate. Right. So we think if in social media, there should have been a lot more funding and there should have been a push to make those findings more useful for policy instead of these, primitive debates that we're having now. In a more positive direction, I think AI can actually help with a lot of this. So, like, one way in which it can help is right now there is a big lag between the government deciding that it wants public input on a particular topic to then going and collecting that input, and then digesting that input, and then deciding what to do with that. That process can be cut down a lot. So governments have these notice and comment processes that most members of the public don't even know about. And even when they do, it takes a year-long process in the U.S. at least to kick that into motion and collect feedback. We've in our research group, we've been looking at all this and saying, wait a minute, people are already sharing their opinions online. So why don't we just build AI to summarize what people have said on any particular topic? On copyright, there has been a big debate about how AI is affecting artists and other kinds of creators. So why don't we take all of that, all of what they've said, and identify the main themes in that writing. And this can be done in a matter of hours. It's not quite the same as having a deliberative process, but I think it's an important complement to it. It can greatly cut down the time involved for policymakers to get at least an initial idea of how a particular technology or how a particular regulation is affecting people at large. And so these are all opportunities for making policy more reactive to changes in the world, changes in technology.
Is that published work or a working paper, work in progress?
Work in progress, yes. Yeah.
Work in progress. Okay. So it sounds like a great idea, and I'm very much looking forward to read what you have to say on the subject. You also mentioned, those call for contributions, and even then, you can also use NLP. And I know that some antitrust agencies are moving in this direction to actually process what people are telling you, and some agencies will actually give you the possibility to lodge a complaint. And well, you may also want to automate that and see if there are trends amongst what people have to say. So we can move in this direction of the time for law to be more in correlation with the time for market and technology. Okay, let's stay on this idea of good governance for now. You have a separate paper entitled Foundation Models Transparency Reports, where you and your co-authors, you have developed a, I quote, foundation model transparency index that comprises 100 indicators to document the transparency of foundation models. How can it be used by policymakers listening to us right now if they indeed want to preserve the common good and increase transparency?
Right. There are two separate projects. One is called the Foundation Model Transparency Index, where I'm an advisor, not a co author. Details are not too important. But the key contribution there that the team did is to identify these 100 indicators that consist of basically all the questions that you might want to ask about a foundation model, not just how it was built and information about its internals, but if it's a proprietary model like GPT-4 being used in ChatGPT, also information about how people are using it, and how any information about misuse and that sort of thing. So it just covers the whole spectrum of things. So the whole supply chain, if you will, going from the assets like data sets that were used to build the model to the model itself, where it's being used, and downstream applications that build on top of the model. So that gives you a much clearer picture of the kinds of things that policymakers might want to know, whether it's misuse risks or whether it's copyright concerns about the data that went into it. What the team found is that right now, most foundation model developers are not very transparent. The open source ones, as you might expect, are more transparent. There's a lot of room for improvement. And after this work came out, companies have been making efforts to improve their scores on this index. The foundation model transparency reports work builds on that and says, let's come up with this unified kind of format for collecting all of this data together to make it more digestible and provide companies an easy and streamlined way to provide this information.
So, are you mining the data yourself, or do you have implemented processes for companies to be able to send you the data, which is something that government may be able to steal from you?
Right. So yeah, the foundation model transparency index team, I think they started by compiling the data themselves, but then started talking to companies, and I think they have now moved mostly to a model where companies are sending them the
Yeah.
data.
Okay, let's switch now to policymakers seeking to maximize other interests than the common good, such as their own interests, and prepare for a long question. So here we go. In chapter 8 of your book, and this is one example that I will take because I think it's very telling, you talk about the relationship between automation technology and jobs. And you highlight that, and I quote, of the hundreds of occupations listed in 1950 by the US Census, only one disappeared due to automation, and that is elevator operator. And I quote you, in other cases, the technology becomes obsolete, which then removes the need for job categories related to it, such as the telegraph operator. End of quote. But generally, you argue that we see three common effects of technology on jobs. Number one, we see that technology may decrease the number of people working in a job, such as the impact of AI on translators. Number two, we see that technology may actually lead to more jobs in the sector, such as the introduction of ATMs, which actually increase the number of banks. And number three, technology may change the nature of a job. For example, librarians, they have a very much different job today than they used to have 50 years ago. All right. In that context, where you would hope for policymakers to come up with nuanced policies, one may fear that they will actually come with harsh policies and buy this idea of we're all going to die or technology will take all of our jobs, which is something following US elections that we hear once in a while. So I know you've been sitting on numerous panels to inform policymakers. You are leading the Princeton Center for Information Technology Policy. So, given that experience, if possible, how do we prevent that capture when it comes to AI?
Yeah, that's a great question. Uh, I mean, yes, I have to some extent advised policymakers, although I would say that this is a question, that's obviously broader than computer scientists and AI experts. I think I'd be very curious to hear what economists have to say about this, but also, labor organizers who often bring a different perspective. So I think we definitely need a diversity of voices here. I'll just make a couple of remarks on this. I think we should try to avoid the tendency to try to predict how technology will affect a particular occupation. I think historically we've been very bad at that. So, yeah, going back to that bank teller example, everyone would have thought that the ATM machine would decrease the number of bank tellers possibly to zero, but it turned out that it became a lot cheaper for banks to open regional branches. And so they started doing a lot more of that. And there was some need for tellers in those branches. So the overall number of tellers actually increased slightly. In other cases, technology, might make workers more productive, or even change the nature of the jobs. It might make the job more fun, less fun. I think these are all important factors that are often not captured in the data. So I think prediction is hard. I think what is much more important is to be adaptable to the different kinds of impacts that might happen. And the second thing I'll say is that what determines the nature of the impact is less about the capabilities of the technology itself and often more about the power relationship between the worker and the firm. So, to give an example of my job, maybe around 10 years ago, when these massive online open courses started becoming popular, a lot of people predicted that that's it, that's the end for college professors. But the thing is, at least in universities like mine, in elite universities, we're a very privileged bunch. And we have a lot of power, I would say too much power in the university. So there's really no scenario in which a university is going to survive in a form where the job of a professor has been mostly automated. And that's less because of what the technology is capable of. Again, I think I'm of the belief that most of my lectures actually can be recorded, and my teaching time can be better spent on kind of one-on-one or smaller group interactions.
Hmm.
But I think the reason those kinds of changes often don't happen, or even if they do happen, the job of the professor is redefined so that overall the impact is almost never negative. It just really comes down to a function of the power relationship. On the other hand, if you look at a job where the worker doesn't hold a lot of power, there was this really visceral example of the National Eating Disorder Association in the United States last year, where they fired their hotline operators for eating disorder patients and replaced them with a chatbot. the chatbot, did a terrible job. They had to take it down within a few days. I mean, they must have known how awful the chatbot was, right? But that didn't stop them. The chatbot was just an excuse for them to fire these people and cut costs. And that was a result of the fact that they were not unionized. In fact, this move happened shortly after they started trying to unionize. So I assume they were worried about the implications of unionization. So those are, I think, the kinds of interventions that are the most valuable. Change the worker protections that we have, change the power relationship between the worker and the firm, so that whatever technological disruptions happen will be to the benefit of the workers instead of to primarily to the benefit of the firm.
Yeah, so let's assume now that because of those checks and balances and pressure put by all different sides of society, we can actually come up with okay regulation. Still, it doesn't mean that there is just one way to regulate and to intervene in the space. Please tell us about Kai and Maya's world. Who are they? What are they? And what role is regulation playing in both?
Sure. So we ended the book with these two vignettes asking readers to imagine a child born, today roughly, or 2023 or something like that, when AI is already pretty capable. So AI is going to be a pretty big part of these kids' lives growing up. And we paint one optimistic and one pessimistic picture. Kai is the more pessimistic picture where people kind of take the claims of AI companies for granted. So these things are treated as infallible almost. And we've mostly talked about generative AI in this conversation, but a big part of what the book is about is predictive AI. So this is AI that's making consequential decisions in people's lives, whether it's college admissions or hiring or loans or even in the criminal justice system. And in our research, we've been pointing out that this type of AI doesn't really work, and we've been severely critical of it. In Kai's worlds, there is a lot of predictive AI, and with generative AI, it is again treated as very powerful, and there's so much fear about what could happen that governments clamp down on generative AI to the extent that it doesn't allow the opportunity for the development of an industry that can cater AI to the development of children in a healthy way. And instead, the AI that kids do use is not child safe, is kind of skirting the law in a way, and is often very addictive technology. So our view is that when it comes to generative AI, we should, we should assume that this technology is going to be with us. It has good and bad effects, and we should try to channel the technology in a way that maximizes the good effects. And our view on predictive AI is we should be very skeptical, and we should not be using it as much as we are. I don't think it should be used in the criminal justice system, for instance, to predict who is going to commit another crime or things like that, which at least in the United States, is happening in the majority of cases today. So that's our view. And in Maya's world, we present a more optimistic picture where there's a lot more funding to actually understand the interaction of AI with kids and to kind of nudge the development of this industry in a healthy and responsible way.
All right. So, in that word, so in Maya's world, you argue that antitrust, which is my background, so of course I got interested in that, is playing a positive role by forcing interoperability among social media. But of course, antitrust can't do much in terms of creating network effect, right? So making it attractive to move to another social media, even if it's technically possible to actually take all of your pictures and videos and put it there. And I fear that we often assign, and by we, I mean all of us, especially us doing antitrust, too much importance to what antitrust may achieve regarding innovation, when in practice, well, it's a lot of the time, it's actually innovation that drives competition. And to my mind, this is where blockchain enters the conversation, and more specifically, Web3 powered social media, where users can interact from different platforms because they run on the same layer one blockchain. No, now, I know that you've done quite some work on blockchain in the past. The question would be, don't you think that blockchain will actually play a role in shaping Kai's and Maya's world? And to me, the answer is possibly, hard to say. But for that reason, because there is a possibility, I would argue that a role for antitrust might be actually to ensure that regulation, maybe not on purpose, but still, does not favor Web2 big players over Web3 projects. And to come back to our AI conversation, and I will end there, I would see a role for antitrust agencies to ensure that regulation is not putting open source AI as a disadvantage compared to closed source AI due to regulation. Now, unfortunately, antitrust agencies, they typically prefer to focus on the practices of companies rather than also going after the legislator. So what's your take on that?
Yeah, those are totally fair comments. I'm very positive on decentralized social media. I think positive in the sense that I think if decentralized social media became mainstream and were a viable option, it would have a lot of positive effects. As things stand now, I think the chance of that actually happening is pretty low. For a lot of the headwinds that you mentioned, yes, it's a very innovative space, but it's just hard to compete against these incumbents and their negative effects. So I think antitrust and better interoperability requirements can help a little bit, but I definitely take your point that that's not the end of the story. Ultimately, we have to have innovation, and I think that's a collective responsibility. I think universities, for instance, should be working more to develop and promote decentralized social media. Other civil society organizations have a role, journalists have a role, and so forth. So I think if a lot of stars align, then decentralized social media can start to play a much bigger role. I'm a blockchain skeptic. I spent 5 or 6 years of my career working on blockchain technology, and around 2018, I became very disillusioned, and then I quit, and I've not worked on it ever since. I think, yeah, maybe there is a role for blockchain as an enabler of decentralized social media, but at this time, I don't see it. I'm positive on decentralized social media, but skeptical of blockchain, basically. And yeah, I broadly agree with everything you said. I think um, antitrust agencies should be very mindful of the impact on open source.
Yeah, and to be fair, you do mention antitrust as one of the many factors, right? So, okay, let me ask a very final question. In 20 years from now, if you could choose one idea from your book that people would still remember, which one would it be? I know it's hard and unfair,
Yeah,
but it's
yeah.
fun.
Uh, Yeah, I would say just to remember that people and organizations and institutions and society have agency. We push back against technological determinism. For instance, going back to your earlier question of the impact of technology on jobs, we think that's primarily a function of what people choose to do with that technology than the capabilities of the technology itself. And we, when faced with the myth of AI as being super powerful, we it's easy to lose sense of that agency. um, but I think we can and must demand to channel the development of AI or any other technology in a way that benefits society. That's not easy. It'll take a lot of collective action. It'll take a lot of regulation. It'll take a thriving civil society. But yeah, that's what needs to happen, and we're cautiously optimistic that it can happen.
Yeah, so in 2024, already we knew and highlighted that we do have agency. Now, of course, the podcast is called Scaling Theory, which comes from complexity science. And one of the premises is that people do adapt to new environments and situations, right? They do not simply suffer from changes in their environments, technology being one of those many parameters in the environment. So I cannot agree more on that. Um, Again, thank you so very much for your work. All the publications I mentioned are listed in the description to this episode of the podcast. Your book, as I mentioned already, will be available later this year in September 2024, already available for pre-order. And on that, take care of yourself, and if you can, someone else too. Bye-bye.
Thank you. This has been such a fun conversation.